Deep Sea Embers Chapter 11 to 20. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 11 Inches Alice. Duncan swore he would never forget this picture for the rest of his life, a gorgeous coffin undulating in the eerie and dangerous sea, and a mysterious goth doll patting the sides and riding the waves like some sort of surfer. And, most importantly, the doll doesn't seem to be very happy. This was so creepy no matter the angle. Should Duncan be surprised that the doll was moving? Or should he be wowed by her arrogance to use a coffin as a rowing boat or surfboard? Regardless, the tenacity and determination of the doll to return aboard was something to behold. He had to give her credit for that. Then before Duncan had realized it, the doll had managed to come aboard, and this time he got the full show on how she managed it. By clinging onto some protruding wood from the stern, the doll was able to heave herself up with the coffin magically floating up beside herself. Ignoring the weight alone, the dexterity required for such a feat would put any acrobat to the test. Not letting this chance slide, he promptly hurried back to the deck. Apparently, the puppet doll didn't realize she had been caught red-handed and was continuing to get things in order. With a wave of a finger, the coffin slowly floated down beside her feet. That done, she began to sort out her now dripping dress and crawled inside the box with her feet first. But halfway through the climb, she stopped after hearing the audible click of a gun being unlocked, followed closely by a pirate sword that came up to her chin. The doll's movements instantly froze. She tried to rigidly turn her head, only to be confronted by a burning green-flamed ghost captain staring down at herself coldly. "Humph, I caught you now, Dolly." The doll visibly trembled in front of Duncan's eyes and wanted to shrink away to avoid his gaze. However, what came of the nervous wreck were nothing more than clinks and clacks of joints too scared to move. Then her head fell off. Ads by PubFuture. In front of Duncan, a beautiful head rolled next to his feet with sprawling silvery hair that mangled itself around the face. Funnily enough, the doll's body continued to move by grasping blankly into the air while pleading, "Help, help, help." It's no exaggeration to say that Duncan's heart had stopped beating, although he doubted his heart existed right now due to his flaming ghostly form. Nevertheless, watching a headless doll continuing to move still freaked him out. Finally, after much willpower and self-calming, Duncan used his brain to assess the situation. From what he found, the doll had more fear of him than he had of her. This instantly cleared the tenseness in his posture now that he knew the great Captain Duncan was still effective against cursed items. Putting the gun away while still holding the sword, Duncan picks up the doll's head with his free hand. Sure, he knows it's technically not a living thing, but just holding a talking head was enough to give him the creeps. It's just too weird no matter what he told himself. But alas, he restrained his inner urge to toss the head overboard and looked it in the eye. "Do you want me to help you place it back on?" "Yes, yes, yes. All right, you do it yourself." Duncan nodded and casually tossed the head into the other party's hand, which was grasping haphazardly at the air still. Surprisingly, those hands were extremely skillful and dexterous when playing catch. Once safely in her own arms, the gothic doll first sorted her silvery hair, somewhat messy from all the rolling, then snapped it back on the neck with an audible clean click. The whole process was smooth and flawless, meaning it was not the first time the doll had done this maneuver. Immediately after that, the doll's somewhat stiff face came alive, blinking those long batting eyelashes before issuing a long exhale. "Phew, I'm alive again." Duncan. No matter how he thought about it, Duncan felt like he should say some curse word in a complaint, but after remembering his, Captain Duncan, identity, he promptly lost the idea. Being exposed before this doll gave him nothing but bad vibes. N-O-V-E in .com. Ads by PubFuture. Very good, now come with me. It's time we talked about why you keep coming aboard my ship. As he spoke, he scattered the ghost flames wrapped around his body and returned to his original appearance. Actively transforming into his ghostly form had come naturally to him now. Nevertheless, it's far from what one would call skillful, since this was the best he could do aside from steering the Vanished. The cursed doll obediently stood up from the coffin and was immediately surprised to see Duncan regain his human form. Are you not a ghost?" Duncan glanced at her sideways. "When necessary, I can be." The doll didn't speak, only clasping her head in support like the awe in her eyes would pop the thing off again. Duncan didn't know why the cursed doll would make such a face for one, but he's not going to bash that misconception. Anything to help his image as the infamous ghost pirate that ruled the boundless sea. Turning away without looking back, he began to head for the captain's quarter while letting his connection with the vanished tell him what was happening. The gothic doll was initially hesitant to follow, but that didn't last long once the coffin floated up from the floorboard and moved with her. Under the gloomy gaze of the wooden goat head, the ghost captain and the cursed doll sat across from one another at the mapping table, the former relaxing in his reclining chair while the puppet fidgeted uncomfortably with the coffin floating behind her. There's no question the gothic doll was a true beauty from the surface level, but whenever Duncan looked at that figure, all he could see now was the incredible picture of a surfer riding the waves with a coffin. Sighing at his own silliness, he resumes his cold and imposing facade. Name: Alice. Race: puppet doll. Occupation: doll. Why ask me this? Duncan thought for a moment, for some basic understanding. Chapter 12 Inches Ghost Captain and Cursed Doll. As the two supernatural beings sat across from each other with the large mapping table at the middle, the atmosphere between them, though neither of them may be human, was arguably harmonious. The puppet lady, who called herself Alice, still looked slightly nervous. Although the ghost captain in front of her had promised temporary safety, it didn't change the fact that the cursed doll was obviously uneasy in front of Duncan's naturally +10 threatening face. Also, the uncomfortable pinching of fingers and grasping of the skirt exposed her. On the other hand, Duncan remained momentarily silent and only observed the lady in front of him. A doll driven by an unknown force, a supernatural individual, who was not of flesh and blood but could walk and speak like an average person. If placed in his hometown, Alice would surely be kidnapped by some mad scientist and dissected for knowledge. Duncan didn't know what kind of category a doll like Alice belonged to in this world, but in the process of exploring this world in the past few days, he's gotten enough information to make a guess. On this side, there are indeed supernatural existences, and there are things that science couldn't explain. As for the doll sitting in front of him, Duncan guessed that she likely belonged to a unique category of existences that's considered strange even in this already freaky world. His guess didn't come without supported facts, like that mechanical steamship that collided with the vanished. From what he saw, those sailors were well trained and experienced. Even amidst great fear, many of them didn't leave their posts. Also, he didn't miss the strange rune markings inside the other ship, which were styled similar to the ones on Alice's coffin. In other words, the purpose of such a cutting-edge ship was most likely meant to be used as an escort, for Alice the cursed doll. Duncan adjusted his posture and stared deeply at the uncomfortable Alice with his serious face. There was no doubt that he had an incredible guest on his ship. But from another point of view, this puppet doll lady did not seem to be a terrible character, and her courage was lacking. After all, he didn't even utter a word, and the lady had already dropped her head in fright. If that's not a scaredy cat, then what is? Excuse me, probably because the extended silence and gaze brought too much pressure, but Alice finally couldn't take it and broke the silence, and ads by PubFuture. Where are you from? Duncan withdrew his oppressive gaze and asked in a calmer tone. Alice was visibly stunned. As if reflecting on the meaning of Duncan's question, she took several seconds to respond by tapping her finger on the coffin. From here. Duncan's expression instantly froze from being dumbfounded. Of course I know you've been lying in this box before, he coughed awkwardly, but what I'm asking is where you're coming from, the location, understand? Do you have a hometown? Or something that can be called a place of departure? Alice thought about it again and shook her head calmly. I can't remember exactly. Can't remember? Where do you believe a doll comes from? Alice folded her arms around the chest to speak earnestly. Most of my memories were me lying in that box when I'm being transported. Occasionally I can sense the vague presence of people walking around or guarding the box. I also remember overhearing some whispering conversations of the men guarding my box. From what I gathered, they all sounded fearful and nervous about the topic. Duncan cocked an eyebrow. Talking about something? What are they talking about around you? It's just boring trivial stuff. But I am curious, Duncan said seriously. He believed that it might really be nothing more than bland, trivial things, but that's exactly the stuff he needs. Anything to help him gain a better picture of this world. Fine then. The most commonly heard name is Anomaly 099. They seem to use this name when referring to me in my wooden box. But I'm not fond of it. I have a name called Alice. Besides the occasional conversation about seals and curses or something, most of their words are a blur to me. I'm always asleep in my box, so I didn't bother to pay attention to what's happening outside. The doll spoke unhurriedly, and then, as if suddenly remembering something, added, but what I have heard recently is still clear in my head. It must have been before I came to your ship, and the voices of those talking outside the box frequently mentioned a place, the city-state of Plant, which seemed to be their destination, perhaps my destination too. The city-state of Plant. Duncan's eyes lowered in thought and silently wrote down this name in his heart. He finally learned something useful again. However, he did not know when this useful information would come in handy. Then he lifted his head and stared at the puppet lady in front of him again. What else? Besides this, I spent most of my time sleeping, Mr. Captain, said Miss Puppet with a serious and pruned face. When you are locked in a large coffin-like box, surrounded by groggy whispers, what else can you do aside from sleeping? Am I supposed to do sit-ups or something? The corners of Duncan's mouth twitched. He couldn't deny the doll gave off an air of dignity and elegance when her head was screwed on right, but the stuff she said was more in line with her image of a surfer riding the waves, blunt and forceful. He needs to quickly build a new image of Miss Alice in his mind lest he gets surprised some more by her manner of speaking. But on the surface, he still maintained the image of the calm and majestic Captain Duncan. So, apart from being groggy in the wooden box, you know nothing about the outside world. Not the changes in today's times, nor where the port city is. I'm afraid so, Captain, Miss Puppet Doll nodded solemnly, and then her eyes widened slightly as if she had thought of something scary. Then, acting all nervous in the face, so, are you going to throw me off the ship again? Because I don't have much value anymore. N-O-V-L-B-J-N.C. Ohm. Before Duncan could speak, he heard Alice talk again. Fine, I understand this is your ship after all, but can you please stop stuffing cannonballs into the box this time? Seriously, 8 iron balls are too much. It could be seen that the doll lady wasn't in a very good mood and was actively suppressing her displeasure at the manner in which she's been treated. Duncan was also very embarrassed by the last remark. Mainly regarding the fact that he presumed Alice to be those cursed items from the horror movies. If he had known she could converse like a normal person, Duncan swears he would never do something so rude as stuffing 8 cannonballs in that box. However, Duncan had been known to have thick skins, and being the shameless asshole that he was, he ignored the blaming words and continued the conversation. I still haven't decided on tossing you overboard or not yet. After all, you always seem to have a way of returning aboard. I am curious though, why do you insist on returning to the Vanished? I can tell you're afraid of me, and you're afraid of the ship. If so, why not stay away from the danger? Is this ship called the Vanished? All right, you caught me. I am indeed a little afraid of you and the ship. But compared to this, isn't the depths of the open sea more dangerous? Alice silently met the ghost captain's gaze. From her field of vision, the tall and imposing man was shrouded by an endless murky darkness, which overlapped with the real image of the cabin and created a seemingly twisted picture of 2 overlapping realities. However, compared to the horrors lurking within the depths of the boundless sea, she would much rather pick the former instead of the latter. In this world, is there anything more frightening than the deep sea? Chapter 13 Inches Bed Neck. The deep sea was something to be feared. Despite being a doll, Alice could still express her emotions through the face by means that are difficult to explain. So, Duncan had no doubt about detecting the fears in the doll's eyes and the truth of the matter. There has to be something far more dangerous than himself lurking under the water. In retrospect, this also made him more curious about what's out there. What's the land like, or what was considered normal? However, the doll in front of him didn't have the answer. From what he suspects, the groggy state of her memory must have been mostly due to the seal placed on the coffin. Following that clue, the cursed doll must be deeply feared by civilized society. Again, you don't remember where you came from, and you can't remember what you've been through in the past, right? He asks again to confirm. I don't remember, Alice replied very seriously. I've been lying in this big box for as long as I can remember. Though I don't know why there is always a group of nervous people around me like I would come out, but honestly speaking, your act of putting nails on my box to seal it is quite nice in comparison. Although you did place 8 cannonballs afterward, at least you didn't pour lead into it. This time, Duncan did not care about Alice's useless remark and continued to ask, "Where did your name come from? Who gave you that name? If you really never left the box and never had contact with anyone else, why did you have a name? Could it be that you gave it to yourself?" Alice was suddenly stunned. She seemed lost, remaining in a daze for over 10 seconds to the point that Duncan got worried there was a self-destruct setting inside the doll. Thankfully Alice eventually came back to her senses. I don't remember. I know my name is Alice, but the name wasn't coined by me. She muttered in confusion and subconsciously supported her head with those hands, which made Duncan freak out in the face. Quickly shouting before it's too late, "All right, if you don't remember then that's fine, just don't pull your head off." Ads by PubFuture. Alice. After this, Duncan asked many more questions, but unfortunately, most of them were fruitless. As Miss Doll herself has said, she spent most of her conscious time in that coffin, maintaining a state of alternating sleep and partial awareness of her surroundings. In the end, her knowledge of trivial matters could hardly piece together the outline of the world. But even so, Duncan wasn't without gain. In his conversation with Alice, he identified at least a few things. There's a power structure in this world called the city-state. A word that repeatedly appears in the narration of the doll lady and constitutes almost the entirety of her journey was a place called Planned. It seemed to be a thriving place, and sailors said that it held importance on many shipping routes through their conversations. Secondly, Alice also has the name Anomaly 099, which seems to be an official title given to her by the civilized world. As for Alice, there doesn't seem to be anyone else who knows this name aside from these two. Lastly, Alice had been being transferred from one city-state to another, and from how things looked, she doesn't seem to be the only abnormal being moved in such a manner. Apparently, the guards had mentioned other seals on occasion, which Duncan could confirm by the other storage rooms that had similar runes etched along the walls on that steamship. Going by all these clues, Duncan could boldly speculate such transfers are a necessity in this world. As to why it's required, he doesn't know. But one thing's clear, the civilized world doesn't want things like Alice to escape and run amok. I wonder what's so terrible about Alice that they have to go through such lengths. She's most certainly a cursed doll, but what is so dangerous about her? If anything, she's a total coward. November LBJNN. Frankly, Duncan was quite disappointed by not getting more from this discussion. Ads by PubFuture. He thought he had finally found a channel to help him understand the world, but he did not expect the lady lying in the coffin to be as confused as he was. But when his gaze swept over Alice again, who was still sitting quietly on the wooden box, the disappointment faded a little. At least, he now had one more person to converse with on the vanished, though she seemed to be a doll and would occasionally drop her head off in a horrified manner, plus she has more secrets than even she herself knows. Still, it's leagues ahead of conversing with the annoying goat head sitting on the mapping table. And speaking of spooky dangers, which part of the boundless sea and vanished hinted at safety? Even from the perspective of others, his own identity of Captain Duncan seemed more dangerous than the average spooks. Duncan exhaled and unconsciously soothed his stern expression to a more homely one. "I want to know what you will do if I throw you off the ship again." Alice blinked. "Are you still going to stuff cannonballs into my box again?" "No." "What about the nails?" No." "Then what about lead?" Ads by PubFuture. "No, I mean, if I refuse you permission to stay aboard." "Then I'll row back on my own," Alice said as she sat demurely with a calm face. "I don't want to be swallowed up by the sea, and there's at least a place to stand on with this ship." Duncan was so shocked by the doll's frankness that he didn't know whether to say she was honest or thick-skinned. After much deliberation, he came up with a reply. "You can be a little vaguer next time." "You already know the answer anyway, don't you?" Alice smiled and said, "But if I do come back, I might instead find a way to hide somewhere in the cabins from you, and I won't run to the deck foolishly. I've been awake for a bit of time now, so I've got experience." Duncan interrupted her. "My senses span across the ship, right down to the waves hitting its hull. I can tell where you are at any moment." Alice's words were suddenly stumped. Duncan continued with a calm face, "And I can also choose to destroy you directly and use a more thorough way to avoid you from continuing to pester my vanished and me." Miss Doll here didn't seem to have thought about this possibility and started to widen her eyes until her neck made a snapping noise. The headless doll frantically caught her head in mid-drop, then with an irritable face, Alice popped it back on before Duncan continued. However, I suddenly find it's not bad to have an extra crew member on this ship. I can arrange a place for you here. You should have said so earlier. I was so scared that my head popped off again. Duncan finally couldn't stop the twitching. So what the hell is going on with your neck? Alice made an innocent face. I don't know. I usually don't have so many opportunities to come out and move about. I didn't know my body had such problems. Duncan stared at Alice for several silent seconds before confirming there was no falsehood in her words. It seems lying down in a bed for so long isn't good for your spine and neck. Alice. Duncan's mood suddenly improved at seeing his ability to leave the doll speechless. Well, all in all, we now have a new crew member on the Vanished. Come with me, I'll arrange a resting quarter for you. Chapter 14 Inches Harmless Crew Member. The Vanished was large, surprisingly large. As a sail-powered vessel, its size seemed to exceed the necessary limits of its purpose. Nevertheless, such a large size did mean larger warehouses, more cannons, stronger structures, and a more stable posture in the face of wind and waves, all of which meant it was enough to face the most arduous challenges in a long voyage. But at the moment, Duncan had no plans for the so-called voyage, and the surprisingly large ghost ship brought him only a sense of loneliness. All of which wouldn't be so bad if there's an extra crewmate to talk to. Anyways, there are plenty of idle, guest rooms, for the doll to use as a result. Footsteps broke the silence in the eerie corridor, and Duncan took the gothic doll down the wooden staircase to the lower cabin of the aft deck, which was located directly below the captain's room. From the structural point of view, this should be regarded as the upper living area in this big ship, which was more or less bright and tidy than the dark and spooky areas of the lower deck. Eventually, Duncan stopped in front of a crew cabin and casually pushed open the lightly closed wooden door. There are several single cabins like this on board with simple furnishings, but they have been idle for so long that it's hard to find any sign of people ever using them. These were some of the first things Duncan discovered from his initial exploration of the upper area of the Vanished. He did not think much about it at the time, but now that he was personally in charge of the ghost ship and knew the secret of the ship's ability to sail alone, a question arose: since this ship did not need a crew at all, then who are these crew cabins on the ship for? The single rooms in the upper cabins are obviously reserved for the higher-ranked seafarers such as the first mate, the second mate, and lead deckhand, while in the lower areas there are bunk cabins for the general crew. In addition to the ship's obvious multi-person dining quarter and recreation room, the existence of these facilities in itself were meant for people. Duncan frowned slightly, realizing that this ghost ship must have some history prior to sailing the sea alone. At the very least, it did have a crew once upon a time. So what happened in the past to make the ship what it is today? Where did the original crew of the ship go? Is the real Captain Duncan the owner of the ship from the start? What does that weird goat head know? Captain, a questioning voice suddenly came from behind and interrupted his thoughts. Duncan had forgotten for a moment that Alice was still there due to adapting to the solitude of being alone for so long. My name is Duncan. You can call me Captain Duncan. Of course, it's your freedom to address me as Captain. Duncan quickly straightened his expression before turning to meet the lady's gaze. This empty room will be yours from now on. Go inside and have a look. Ah, okay, Alice nodded, first poking her head over Duncan's shoulder to see what was in the room. Then turning around to grab her box floating behind herself, she finally strode inside on her own. Seeing Alice's coffin, that has always been inseparable from the doll, Duncan couldn't resist the urge to comment, "Do you always carry that box around with you at all times?" "Yeah," said Alice in a matter of course, "where else would I put it?" "But this box was your seal. I thought you would be more wary of it." Duncan frowned. "Now it seems you can't do without it." "It's the people who sealed me, so it's not the box's fault," Alice said as she sat down on her coffin and patted the lid. "Are you going to come in and take a seat?" Duncan shook his head. "No, how do you feel about this room?" "Ah, it's very good." Alice looked pleased as she scanned the simple furnishings as if they were some splendid decors. "Is that a wardrobe? I don't have any clothes to replace and shouldn't be able to use it, but it's nice to have a cupboard. Oh, and there's a table on which I can put stuff on in the future. But I don't seem to have anything to put. Maybe I can use it for my head when I need to comb my hair. It's more convenient being able to reach all the angles." "It's good that you're satisfied." It was strange to watch a gothic doll planning her future life plans in this manner. You can rest for a while and adapt to the environment. I'm heading back upstairs first. Also, do not go downstairs to the lower deck. You can move freely on this floor and above. Look for me in my captain's quarter if you need something. If I'm not there, talk to the goat head on the mapping table. He's my first mate. Alice nodded as she listened, but when she heard the last two sentences, her eyes widened suddenly. Goat head. That pitch-black wooden carving. N-O-V-E in .c ohm. Looks like you've noticed it. I noticed, but you say it can talk. And as your first mate. Alice looked amazed. I thought it was just, it's incredible. You're a doll who can talk and move, Duncan expressionlessly stated as he eyed the doll, and you still think a talking goat head is incredible. Alice appeared taken aback by that comment. Looking down at her own hands, she mutters as if she just realized this fact. Ah, now that you mention it. Duncan shook his head and turned away. That's about it. You take your time here, and if you need something, come look for me. Okay, Captain. After leaving, Duncan did not go anywhere else, but straight to his captain's room and sat down in front of the mapping table. The goat head. Ah, it's the captain. It looks like you've settled the lady in nicely. You see, like I said, a gentle and harmless lady who doesn't do any harm to your journey and can chat with you to relieve boredom. I see you've decided to leave her aboard. Are you going to arrange something for her to do? The Vanished doesn't need much people. The deck will clean itself and scrub the cannon. The water tank also maintains itself. Perhaps she can manage the kitchen. You seem to have been less than happy with the food on board. Ah, speaking of food, it seems that we need to add some ingredients first. The jerky and hard cheese in the warehouse may be a little old. Although a rough seafarer would not be picky about the food at sea, the great Captain Duncan must. Duncan felt his brain juices boiling, and he was once again convinced of one thing. He really needed a normal conversation partner, like Alice with this noisy goat head around. Shut up, he glared at the goat head, and only after the latter had closed its mouth did he continue. You were acting very honest when Alice was around. To think I had believed you were finally able to stay quiet. One mustn't interject when the captain is interviewing a new crew member. This is the rule of the sea, even if I am your loyal first and second mate and lead deckhand. Duncan didn't wait for the goat head to finish. In fact, if he didn't interrupt, the goat head would never finish. Pay attention to the movement of the doll during the next couple of days. Ah, yes, you want me to keep an eye on the lady. Are you still not at ease with her? I understand. Taking precautions is a necessary trait for a good captain. She has a lot of secrets that haven't been revealed yet. Maybe it's because she didn't know it herself yet, or perhaps, she deliberately concealed it from me. Anyways, she's a cursed doll with a code name, Anomaly 099, that much is certain. Duncan said lightly. Those people from the other ship did everything they could to stop Alice from roaming freely. Now that she's a part of the crew, I need a little time to confirm her harmlessness. Even if it's only to the Vanished. Chapter 15 Inches Contacting the Flame. Ever since he had taken the helm, Duncan has had real control of the Vanished and could sense any movement on the ship. But even so, out of caution, he ordered the goat head to keep an eye on the cursed doll at all times. He's had enough self-awareness to know he's not an expert in the field of occultism, and a walking, talking doll was beyond his knowledge. Alice's actions thus far may be harmless, but if the doll lady had some sort of invisible effect on her surroundings, Duncan most likely wouldn't be able to see that, making the goat head more professional in this regard. And even after that, Duncan knew he couldn't keep tabs on everything at all times. Now could he? Although he's decided to survive on this side, he might still have to return to the world opposite of the door when the situation becomes necessary. Thinking of this point, Duncan's eyes slightly narrowed as he glanced at the edge of the mapping table where the goat head sat. Those obsidian-carved eyeballs showed nothing but an empty void when meeting his. When I return, across the door, back to my single-unit apartment, is this goat head aware of it? What happens on the Vanished when I'm not around? This sudden question made Duncan get a little irritated, but under the empty gaze of the goat head, he did dare to show anything to give himself away. Instead, he mentally focused in on Alice's room with his mind to see what she's doing. Of course, he didn't have a voyeuristic fetish. Even if the other person was an inhuman being, it doesn't make it right. Plus, he didn't actually have the ability to see what she's doing, but rather a vague inkling sensation returning from the ship if she's moving or doing anything to destroy the banished. After all, beneath the harmless, elegant and beautiful appearance was in essence, a cursed doll, a dangerous individual called Anomaly 099, by ordinary folks of this world. From what he found, Alice was still in the room, probably studying the furnishings and setting up a place to rest. Ads by PubFuture. This brought a wave of relief to Duncan, which got interrupted again by the goathead's voice. Captain, what are your next arrangements? If you're bored, you're loyal. Shut up. Duncan shot a glare at the goathead before pressing his hands around the edge of the table. With his mind, he brings up the image of him holding the steering wheel above and allows the ghostly green flame to materialize. In a blaze of flame, Duncan's body was transformed into a spirit body again, and the overflowing fire spread along the table until it enveloped the entire room and up into the upper deck, eventually covering the masts and forming a sailing blanket. As a large number of small and large sails flexibly adjusted their angles against the sea breeze, the huge three-masted sailing ship began to accelerate slowly on the vast open sea. Duncan was pleased with what he's done, then shifted his gaze down at the map chart in front of himself, which remained filled with grayish-white fog coiling around the sheet. However, the silhouette representing the vanished was clearly moving and pushing the murkiness away. After a brief thought, he began to try to concentrate his attention on the mapping chart. Then, using the green flame as an extension of himself, he promptly formed a connection with this map and understood something. This chart was an extraordinary item in and of itself with more features than he imagined. As a test, he willed the image on the parchment to magnify around the vanished and vice versa. This proved it was more like a visual radar screen than a mere map. The only con was that it only showed areas explored by the vanished beforehand while everything else continued to be a murky white. Keeping up his facade of indifference despite the glee he held, Duncan expanded the green flame as far as he could manage. From there, his consciousness nearly became one with the ship, sensing every segment of the hull and deck. Maybe, this the power of the captain. Duncan pondered what else he could do with this power. First of all, I must master this green flame if I want to survive out here. As for the next arrangement, the goathead just mentioned, it became obvious to Duncan what he needed to do next after glancing down at the chart. NOVEL-B in .c ohm. Since I don't know enough about the world, I must open up this map by doing some exploration. He didn't need to worry about being robbed anyways since the image of Captain Duncan was obviously some sort of world boss character in this world. He would be lucky if a ship willingly came near him instead of him chasing the other party. Retracting the flames back into his body, Duncan stood up from the mapping table and did his first experiment. He was no longer in his ghostly form, but the translucent ghostly green sails of flame did not disappear like he willed it. It appears he could pick and choose which part turns into spirit form. As for the power source for the green flames out there, it's also not from him, but from the vanished itself, effectively confirming he and the ship are separate entities. Duncan left the mapping table and focused on the door leading to his personal apartment in the other world. He needed a quieter environment to study his newfound powers. But before that happens, he needs someone to oversee the ship's continued voyage while it maps the region. Shifting his gaze down to the goathead, you take the helm. The wooded figurine appeared stunned for a split second, but Captain, you. I have something to do, don't bother me during this time. Duncan didn't seem to care what the goathead would say and commanded. From what he found, the entire vanished was connected to the captain's quarter-like veins to a heart, including the goathead. So, that means the goathead could also tell what's happening on the ship like he did. In fact, Duncan suspected the wooded figurine was some sort of control system for this ghost ship. Imagine a computer on a modern ship with an AI autopilot function in case of emergencies. Duncan was not the builder of the ship, so naturally he didn't know how the ship worked. But this was the best guess he could make at this time. On the other hand, the goathead did always claim to be the first per second mate and lead deckhand. If he couldn't provide this much assistance, then what use was he anyways? Duncan might as well toss the annoying thing away and promote Alice to the position instead. A minute later, the goathead finally responded with an annoyingly cheery voice, all right Captain. You can rest assured that you're loyal. Duncan ignored his words and waved him off. Turning for the door back to his apartment, he casually stepped through the murky fog and closed the door behind himself, thus ending his venture for the day. Chapter 16 Inches Traveling Through the Spirit World. The door closed behind him, blocking the hollow gaze of the goat head from himself. Nevertheless, Duncan could still sense the vanished in the back of his head, like the moving rudders, the adjusting sails, and the stable movement of the vessel on the water. As he expected, the goat head had temporarily taken control and began to carry out his duties as the first mate. But of course, the flexibility and speed of the vanished couldn't be compared to when Duncan headed the helm. Even so, his primary purpose was to further dispel the fog from the mapping chart. It may be slower, but that's of no consequence. After confirming that nothing terrible was happening with the goat head and goth doll, Duncan finally breathed a sigh of relief and glanced around this familiar captain's room. This was his private resting quarter on the ship and the most lavish of all the rooms. In addition to a soft, comfy bed, there's also a large classical wardrobe and shelf against the wall opposite of the door. Sadly, there were no books on those shelves, only a few pens, and tools for writing on the main desk near the window. This area also had several hooks, which was where Duncan found the gun and pirate saber before. Coming up to the writing desk, he placed the weapons down and opened the drawer where a box of gunpowder and pellets were stored. Here, there's also a small brass compass he kept stored among other things. Like usual, the needle behind the glass spun wildly as if pulled by some chaotic force field once he picked it up. Aside from this feature, there's also a set of text inscribed at the bottom metallic casing: "We are all lost souls. November LBJNN." Taking a seat as he played with the compass, Duncan began to review the new pieces of information he had gathered today. This silence continued until he casually ignited a wick of green flame at his fingertip. Gradually, the hand closest to the glow transformed and turned ghostly like he intended, confirming his theory that he could change only parts of himself at will. Then another idea hit him. If he could extend the flame across the vanished, then what about other items that aren't entirely connected to the vessel? Grabbing one of those old ink pens from the table with his free hand, he slowly dipped the metal tip into the greenish flame. Instead of bursting into flame as one would expect, only a little shade of green spread across the surface and gave the Victorian-era pen an eerie glow. Ads by PubFuture. Unlike when he manifested the flames across the sails and rudder, Duncan did not get any feedback from this experiment. Silently writing this finding down in his mind, Duncan concluded the green flame doesn't burn like traditional fire, nor does it have any temperature or feedback on ordinary objects. That brings up another question about what would happen if he tried burning items from outside the vanished. Will the flames react? Duncan pondered the idea for a moment, then came up with the image of the goth puppet doll. Technically, she's not of the vanished. Will she be affected by this ghost fire? But he quickly tossed the idea of burning the doll out the window. No matter if Alice was a cursed doll or a human, she's still an independent individual with consciousness and will. Doing something so inhumane was out of Duncan's ethical standard. Duncan then tested this discovery a few more times to determine if the other items in the room had supernatural properties until he remembered the brass compass was still in his possession. The item lay quietly on the table, and the needle under the glass shell spun wildly as usual. However, perhaps it's his own illusion, but Duncan saw the pointer freeze for a split second when he shot his malicious gaze at the item. Duncan, this thing just reacted to my gaze. Originally, he was a little afraid of the compass. After all, it had the handwriting left by the real Captain Duncan, and he was worried about whether the dead ghost captain had left some kind of power or trap behind to prevent thieves from stealing it. But now, after seeing a reaction from his gaze, he's made up his mind regardless of the risk involved. Ads by PubFuture. Reaching out to grab that cold metallic case, Duncan directly placed his finger with the candlewick of green flame floating at the tip of it. Immediately, the compass ignited into a burst of ghostly fire with countless phantoms flickering inside that glow. Then it stopped. The constant rotating needle now points to a particular direction on the vast open sea. Duncan's heart thumped with excitement. At this moment, he could clearly sense the feedback from the compass, thus confirming it was an abnormal item that his ghost fire could dominate. But before he could examine the details from this connection, a sudden and intense force abruptly swept over him. He only felt his body shake for a moment. The next, it was a total blur. The furniture in the room had turned into nothingness, and even the surrounding walls and roofs disintegrated like snowflakes on a short winter day. Now, only endless darkness remains. Duncan stood in the middle of this hollow black void in amazement. With his heart ringing, his first reaction was to reach for the musket gun and sword placed next to himself. But to his shock and horror, his weapons were gone. Instead, he only found the brass compass still clutching in his hands. Blinking in confusion and daze, countless wisps of thin light threads suddenly filled the area around the compass and intertwined with the surrounding darkness. Before he knew it, dots of starry lights began to emerge, scattering sporadically across the whole landscape like the Milky Way in space. It's truly a magnificent scene to witness because the only way to describe it was a galaxy's birth. Right now, there were a lot of emotions swelling out of Duncan's heart, wariness, unease, but there was never a sense of crisis about any of this. In fact, he found peace here, a long-lost sensation since being trapped in this weird predicament. The next second, Duncan's gaze involuntarily looked upwards towards a cluster of stars. His impression was that it was unstable and about to fade into the darkness completely. Duncan didn't know why nor what compelled him to do this, but he wanted to reach out with his hands and grasp that star. Then a huge pull ripped at him the next. Duncan's entire figure had started to fly, rushing straight for the source of the stars at such breakneck speed that the webs of light that formed around the compass had been left behind, and the star river was no longer visible after becoming a spinning blur in his view. In the rapid flight, he subconsciously wanted to grasp harder against the compass, which was the cause of all this, only to discover it's gone by now. But before crashing into that fading star with no way out, an afterglow from the corner of his eyes suddenly caught Duncan's attention. It was a shadow that emerged near him. It didn't seem unnatural. In fact, it was so natural it didn't even occur to him that it could be anything otherwise. Then he finally got a better picture of that contour. It looked like a bird that was flying with its wings stretched out. Then before he could get any more details, his vision blacked out. When Duncan finally regained a part of his consciousness, he was back in reality on the floor, cold and heavy from whatever supernatural high he had just gone through. Chapter 17 Inches Cave. Cold, damp, and the foul smell of carrion mixed in with the noise of chains rubbing against the ground. Many strange perceptions flooded into Duncan's mind, yet he's unable to open his eyes despite the fact. He felt his soul had been divided into two parts, one part remaining on the vanished, and the other stuffed into an utterly unfamiliar shell, which was as difficult to control as an old and broken tape recorder. The chaotic perceptions were rampaging through the nerves that left his limbs numb and dulled. This uncomfortable sensation lasted for several minutes until it finally faded, allowing Duncan to finally awaken from the long hibernating state and move a little. First opening his eyes, Duncan took in his surroundings. This was a crypt-like space, with burning torches inserted into the stone walls in the distance, and the shaking light of the fire reflected the terrible state around him. Duncan saw many people, or many dead corpses to be exact, thrown together into a mound atop of the mud and rocks. Most are mutilated and ragged with obvious signs of decay from what he saw, which explained the buzzing carrion smell. Eyes aside, his ears also picked up some faint noises, droplets of water dripping down from the top of this cave and the distant sound of sewage water flowing like a river somewhere in these channels. Going by these clues, this cave must be connected to some kind of sewage system. Duncan blinked in confusion and attempted to figure out what's happening. Ignoring the strange environment, he needed to make sure this was even his body for one. Staring down at his right hand, what he saw were 5 scrawny unfamiliar fingers. As for the compass he's been holding before all this, it had disappeared completely. Then glancing around to recall what happened, images of the starry sky and webs of light hit him like a tidal wave. From what he recalled, that shadow at the end should be some kind of bird, but of course, there's nothing like that next to him now. It looks like that bird didn't come into reality like I did. Duncan gently tightened his fingers to form a fist as a means to force the unease back down. Once done, he began to fiddle with this new hand of his until a puff of faintly green flame emerged from his fingertip. It must be said that this ghost fire was far weaker than the one Duncan was used to. Nevertheless, it did dispel the fear of losing this new power of his since he had barely managed to learn to use it yet. Also, his connection with the flame was strange. He clearly noticed another part of his soul not being here but rather back on the vanished sitting at the desk with the brass compass in hand still. It was a peculiar feeling of having split bodies, but Duncan still had a vague awareness of what was going on. A part of his spirit had been projected, or extended, to another mind across unknown distances and burrowed itself in this strange body. This must have something to do with that brass compass. Could this be the power of that item? Duncan had some speculations in mind, but he didn't let the matter take up too much time. After confirming his main body back on the vanished was fine, he began assessing what's the deal with this second body. First of all, he's no longer out at sea anymore, but on land. Actual land that he's been searching so hard for in the past week. Second, this eerie cave doesn't look like a safe place, and the bodies scattered around didn't look like a normal burial scene either. The shell I now occupy, what sort of bad luck did he have to be trapped in such a hell? Inhaling deeply to gather strength so he could sit up, Duncan suddenly noticed something strange with this shell's bodily function. Looking down at where the strangeness was coming from, he widened his eyes at the sight of a huge gaping hole in the chest where the heart should be. WTF. Even if he's nonchalant about a lot of things, Duncan still found himself sweating heavily at this discovery. There are goosebumps rising up from his skin until he realizes something even more frightening. How was he still standing around and able to curse? This is a corpse. After a few moments, Duncan now got a firm understanding of the situation and calmed down. He had no reason to freak out. That was only out of reflex. After all, he's a ghost captain on a cursed ship with an evil goat head-looking gargoyle thingy. If that doesn't scare him, then this much shouldn't. It's not the first time he saw someone lose an important body part, like Alice. She's often dropping her head. With these chaotic thoughts swirling in his mind, Duncan regained his composure at a speed surprising even to himself. Flexing his arms and legs to adjust to the new body, he began stepping over to the corpses strewn about in the cave. I knew it. Duncan found the chests on these corpses were also hollow and missing their hearts. Take the closest body to himself for example. It was a middle-aged man with a gaunt face. Likely a beggar on the streets and has been dead for a while now based on the sunken eye sockets and decaying flesh. Nevertheless, the despair and struggle conveyed in the facial expression told how horrific the experience must have been for the victim. Continuing forward, he soon came upon two other bodies that caught his eye. Unlike the others who mostly only had their hearts cut out, these victims had been violently smashed on the head with a stone. This brought some ideas to Duncan's mind. Perhaps these two had killed themselves off to avoid the pain of having their hearts cut out. To tell the truth, the things in this cave were a little too thrilling for the ordinary folk, and even Duncan felt a little overwhelmed by what he saw. After examining all the corpses, he then found a relatively clean stone in a distant spot to sit down. This gave him time to tidy up and clean out his thought process. November LBJNN. Obviously, this spot was the crime scene of a horrific murder case, but judging from the overly cold and uniform way of killing, it must be more than one murderer, but an evil ceremony of some sort like a cult. Duncan summoned the ghost flame again, feeling the connection between himself and the main body back on the ship. He doesn't know how, but he knew this projected state could be cut off at any time by him. But no, that's not what he wanted. Even if it's only to get some information about the land of this world, it's good enough. After a brief rest and an awkward moment of finding the air coming out of the hole in his heart, Duncan quickly pulled himself up to peer deeper into the darker parts of the cave. He still hasn't located the source of the chain rattling sound he heard earlier. A sign there are probably still living people moving about. At the very least, prisoners. Naturally, carelessly rushing over to check the situation was certainly not safe, but Duncan does not care. He's got an open heart right now anyways. Chapter 18 Inches Underground Sewage System. Before leaving his temporarily hiding spot inside the cave, Duncan first dragged some rags from the nearby corpses and wrapped them around himself as clothes. This was not because he couldn't stand the cold temp, but more or less to block the gaping hole in the heart area. Although having a lethal hole through the chest didn't affect Duncan's ability to survive at all. As a normal human, walking around partially naked was really too creepy. At the very least, he wanted some psychological comfort from not having to hear the wind blowing through his heart. Also, it's common sense to speak to a living human without a huge hole in the chest lest they want to be taken as undead and beheaded in the next. That's how all those zombie movies work, right? After treating the wound with a quick fix, Duncan carefully left the gloomy and damp cave for the passageway connecting to some form of a sewage system. The tunnel was deep, damp, and dark, but there seemed to be hidden ventilation holes set in place for ventilation, meaning there were workers who would occasionally come down. This somehow made it bearable from the stink. Eventually, he came across his first item of interest, oil lamps and torches hanging against both sides of the brick wall at measured intervals. Best of all, it's been used recently, proving this wasn't some abandoned underground facility. After walking another long distance along the predetermined path, Duncan suddenly found himself at a fork road leading to a lower elevation. On top of this, pipes constantly pass waste into the main river, meaning this should be the converging point for the sewer in the resident's home. Quote, he had to take a moment to think about why in heaven would anyone want to commit themselves to such an environment. Not only were the brick walls and sewage water foul to the nose, but it couldn't be good for one's health either. However, there was some good news. If people had constructed such a massive sewage system, it must be catering to a large settlement with some technological advancements in society. This was enough to give Duncan the strength to endure this foul attack on his nose. He wants information about this world, and now he's getting some very key notes about it. Duncan continued to move with increased vigor but was stopped a short distance away when his sight fell upon something built into the wall. It's a glass lamp, but more than the oil version he saw earlier, this one was built inside a sturdy metal casing and stuffed inside the walls. Also, the light it gave off was noticeably brighter than the previous versions. Duncan leaned in and examined the object. Finally, he deduced the energy source was in fact gas spewing up from the hole inside, making this a gas lamp. But it did differ from what he knew from his own world. The shape was different in terms of style, and the glass was inscribed with several slender rune symbols similar to what Alice's coffin had. From what he could tell, they weren't added afterward by a third party but at the factory during production. The runes are a little different, but the air around these are similar. Both sacred and ritualistic. Duncan stepped back and peered further into the sewer tunnel ahead. From here on out, the lights are all gas lamps set in regular intervals instead of the oil and torches. This seemed excessive in his opinion. For an underground facility that hardly gets visited by anyone except for necessary maintenance, why would the workers put this many equipment down here? This couldn't possibly be cheap to maintain or pay for. This gave Duncan a sense that they're trying to repel something lurking here or beings that are hostile towards human civilization from the darkness. N-O-V-E in .c ohm. With that in mind, he trod carefully and continued his exploration until he found something strange again. It's a deep dark red painting set in between two lamps here. Due to its location, this part was dimmer than the other areas of the tunnel, but even so, Duncan could make out its image. It's a pair of hands reaching upwards in the worship of a spherical orb above. The false sun will eventually fall, and the real sun god will be resurrected from blood and fire. The vitality of all things belongs to the sun, and the order of all things belongs to the sun. Duncan stood quietly and read the inscription at the bottom of the creepy painting. He stayed like this for a long time until a noise suddenly caught his attention again. It's the sound of footsteps. Next thing he knew, his eyes were met with several figures in burqas coming his way from the front. Their heads were all shrouded behind a hood so Duncan couldn't see their faces. Nevertheless, he didn't intend to hide from these suspicious fellas or want to in this cramped tunnel. Chapter 19 Inches Underground Gathering Hall. At this moment, Duncan was still the same as when he had just left the cave, thin, scrawny, and only covered in rags. However, the fact that he didn't run and stood there with a huge grin obviously came as a shock to those hooded figures. A sacrifice has escaped, one of them yelled after a brief delay. Quick, stop him, don't let him run, another shouted and began running over, believing Duncan would flee. Don't let him run, a sacrifice has escaped. They kept repeating this despite the other side not moving an inch. As a result, Duncan's shrug and honest act of standing in the middle of the tunnel somehow created a weird and awkward atmosphere that didn't befit the situation. Naturally, this didn't escape the hooded people who had noticed how wrong this was halfway over. Nevertheless, they didn't stop running over and quickly circled their target. Should I have run? The mood is already like this. Duncan scratched his nose like he should have acted a little to match their enthusiasm. Ignoring the cold joke that could freeze a ghost, two of the black hoods warily eyed the escapee and began murmuring something. Why did one manage to escape? Could it be that the hounds of the church discovered this hiding spot, but this one doesn't look like he was let out? Regardless, let's take him back first. This sacrifice doesn't look right. We need to dispose of him quickly. Let the emissary decide. Duncan was completely confused about the background of this gang, let alone what the emissary mentioned by the other party meant. But upon thinking about what he had seen along the way and the word, sacrifice, he could vaguely guess the truth. He didn't know what kind of reaction he should make to be considered a normal sacrifice, and he had no intention of cooperating with these people's performance. This was a temporary body, so Duncan naturally had very little to worry about. "Where are you taking me?" he asks after a little observation. Those in the hoods were obviously surprised to hear the calm opening of the sacrifice. Although they each wore a black mask that completely covered their faces, Duncan could still guess the surprise they felt over his question. "You are not qualified to ask us questions. Take him away," one of the hooded men viciously snaps. "No-vel-b in .c ohm." A few of the black-robed immediately stepped forward and wanted to apprehend the guy. However, Duncan beat them to the punch by taking the initiative. "No need, I'll follow you." The Black Hoods all exchanged looks between themselves, probably feeling the sacrifice in front of them was behaving too abnormal and calm. Nevertheless, the leading black robe waved a hand to signal their silence. "That's for the best. You can't run away anyways, come with us and you might even be given glory and dignity." Several of the gang gathered around Duncan to seal off any chance of escape, leading him back and forth through the deeper channels of the sewer system. The foul smell of the wastewater was disgusting the deeper they went, but these hooded people didn't seem to take notice at all over the dirty and moldy walls. If Duncan wasn't already a dead person in this shell, he might have freaked out already when he stepped on something slimy and goopy. "This is the city-state of planned?" Duncan eventually asks this like he's part of their group. "That's obvious," one of the black-robed replied subconsciously, but then reacted and stared at Duncan like he's seeing a ghost. "You're very calm, boy. Do you know what's going to happen next?" "I can take a probable guess." Duncan nodded with a big smile. "The true sun god, right?" Several of the black-robed halted at that moment, seemingly baffled by how casual the sacrifice mentioned their lord. "Wait, is he a believer of the Lord too?" "No way, he's obviously an escaped sacrifice," the other black-robed whispered back, then glanced at Duncan. "You're quite clever, but don't think that this will save you from being a sacrifice. The Lord has decided your destiny, and you had better embrace it." Duncan did not argue. He knows they're reacting this way due to his unexpected calm attitude. Perhaps they're thinking he's pretending as a way to wiggle his way out of being a sacrifice. Regardless, Duncan didn't care what they thought because it's not like he could move the facial muscles anyway. Necrosis had set in on this shell, so it's a given he behaves this way. "So you think the current sun in the sky is a false sun? That it will one day fall out of the sky sooner or later?" Duncan begins his mission of gathering intelligence. Of course the false sun will fall. This topic was obviously a provoking subject for these cultists, so they were feverish in their reply. Even the lackeys of the church have to admit in the historical chronicles that the sun in the sky is a twisted and grotesque object that only appeared after the Great Calamity. What truly brings life and order to all things in this world is the sun god, but that vile forgery has usurped our Lord. Sooner or later, that vile artifact will fall out of the sky. Immediately afterward, Duncan heard the surrounding cultists also join in support of their leader. Sooner or later the false sun will fall, and the real sun god will be revived through blood and fire. The excess seawater of the world will be banished back into the void by the might of our Lord, and the earth will return to the era of great fertility and stability. Listening to the chant of these cultists, Duncan's mind began racing with his thoughts. He knew this kind of fanatical cultist could not be reasoned with, meaning the information he's receiving was likely distorted and tampered with misinformation. Nevertheless, there are certain details he could use and assume true. The sun hanging in the sky is a fake, and the real sun has been usurped. They firmly believe that the real sun is a fallen deity, and that God will recover from blood and fire. They also mentioned the excess sea water in the world will recede, that the era of abundance and stability will return. What exactly did they mean by that? It didn't take long for the cultists to regain their composure from reciting their religious mantra. After all, they still had a sacrifice to escort. "Have you noticed this? Sacrifice is a bit creepy," one of the cultists asks the leader. "He doesn't seem quite right, I'm a little unsure. Could it be that this sacrifice had been in the lightless underground for too long when he escaped before, and now his head is possessed by something? Then that's perfect, the Lord's power will purify him." Duncan didn't miss their whispering conversation, especially the part about the lightless underground. But just when he wanted to gather more information from them, the black-robed man at the head of the group stopped. "Here we are," the black-robed cultist said in a low, cold voice. Duncan regretted he didn't chase the topic faster, but the scene that came into view attracted him more. Ahead was the nexus of the sewer system, a convergence that led into a spacious underground hall, and there were a lot of black-robed cultists here. Chapter 20 Inches Offering. The scale of the sewer system was so large that, in Duncan's eye, had utterly exceeded the need for the single function of urban sewage. Take the ubiquitous gas lamps with runes for example, and the reinforced structure that served as a shelter for these cultists. All of these things made him wonder a lot about the purpose of the underground facility. But whatever the builders had in mind behind the design, one fact was obvious: in the depths of this vast facility, beyond the gaze of the earthly world, this dark and cold place has become a nursery where evil breeds. A cult that nominally worships the sun, but their actions only warrant cold chills down the spine. At a glance, there are at least hundreds of people in black robes gathered around the underground Nexus Hall, and in the middle high stage was a tall, stoic figure giving a speech to his fellow believers. He didn't have the same hooded setup as the rest though, but a golden mask that radiated endless flames in a hellish manner. Then behind the masked man was another object of note, a high metallic totem burning with a fireball at the top. "We caught an escaped sacrifice." One of the black-robed who had been charged with escorting Duncan stepped forward and reported to the leader, with a tone of praise. This sacrifice stayed inside the darkness for too long, so his mind is slightly confused right now. May the greatness of the Lord bestow salvation to this sad fleshly body of his. The cult leader wearing the golden mask on stage eyed Duncan with an unreadable face before speaking with a hint of surprise. "The sacrifice escaped." November LBJNN. Duncan didn't react at all to being the attention of all, only observing his captors with curiosity and the strange stake totem in the rear. Perhaps, these symbols are strange and bizarre for the ordinary folk in this world, but he only needed a glance to tell they're imitating the sun in the sky. To be clear, it's not the strange ball of light currently hanging in the sky but the real sun according to Duncan's memory from his world. Towards the necrosis face of Duncan's shell, the cult priest in question didn't find it odd that the sacrifice didn't panic and scream. Those who get lost in the darkness tended to appear to lose their minds like a lost soul that has been sucked out of intelligence. Ads by PubFuture. Go and check the place where the sacrifices are being held. The priest eventually turned to a believer closest to him and ordered. After the command, he went ahead and gave the escort a nod and started praising him. "Well done, you have earned great merit for our Lord. May eternal glory shine upon you when the world is illuminated with its light." It was just a painless and unobtrusive compliment, but it was enough to encourage the rest of the black robes in the hall to begin chanting glory to their sun god. While they did so, some also pushed Duncan onto the center stage where the masked priest stood. "Poor soul who has gone astray, can you feel the deep, cold darkness between the crevices of this world?" Duncan couldn't understand what the superstitious stick was saying, so he merely kept his silence and watched. Apparently, this worked because the priest didn't lash out at him and spoke more feverishly. "Cold and darkness are the sufferings left by the false sun to this world. Under the rule of the false sun, the dark oceans ravaged everything, leaving only fragmented small pieces of land for the living to spawn and struggle. But the world is cruel, hiding the shadows of the old era in the underground darkness, awaiting to strike when the chance arises. At this rate, all of humanity will be contaminated by evil. How do we endure this long suffering? How do we endure the distorted and absurd world brought about by the false sun? We can't, that's how. We only wish for our Lord to return. May the true sun god descend upon our earth again. May he burn away the darkness with blood and fire. May he bring order and prosperity back to our world." Instigated by the masked priest's very encouraging tone, Duncan could clearly feel the atmosphere in the assembly hall change. First in agreement, then the echoing fervent cries, "May the real sun god come to the earth again. He shall rise from blood and fire. He shall cleanse our world's darkness with his light. May the true sun god descend to the earth again," said the priest on the stage. Then extending a hand to Duncan, "And today, our Lord will further awaken from his slumber. The blood of the lost soul will soothe his wounds and bring us one step closer to the false sun's collapse." Ads by PubFuture. Bring forward the offerings. Several black-robed men rushed over to push Duncan up there. However, the latter had taken the liberty of climbing up to the stage on his own. Although this body was not very good, it's still possible to bend those legs and arms for a quick climb. Once up there, he came eye to eye with the masked priest, who was still maintaining the air of mystique. Nevertheless, the odd behavior from the sacrifice still caught the priest by surprise, leaving the whole hall eerily quiet. Duncan didn't seem to notice the change in the atmosphere around him at all though. He had just gathered some useful information about this world and was looking forward to seeing more rare scenes before this body was scrapped. So, Duncan rubbed his hands with a certain sense of curiosity. What now? Masked priest, you not hear me? Duncan frowned awkwardly due to the tense muscles on his face. I said, what's next? At this time, the priest finally came back to his senses. Although separated by a mask, there was obviously a moment of confusion in those eyes. In a low voice, the shadow in the darkness has indeed affected your mind, but rest assured, the Supreme and Holy Sun will end your suffering. Bring the sacrifice to the totem. Two black robes immediately stepped up from the side and apprehended the sacrifice by the arms, pulling him over to the totem with the burning fireball at the top. Although Duncan did not show any resistant gestures with his body, but the captors still used a lot of strength to clamp down to the point Duncan could feel the bones on his shoulders were starting to dislocate from the pressure. However, his attention was immediately drawn to the priest again when the guy came over. The masked priest had drawn a strangely shaped dagger out that looked like a twisted dead branch. It glistened with a black light, similar to the obsidian material used for the goat head's eyes back on the vanished. Duncan knew it should be about time as the chance begun to ring out, which he readied himself to cut off the soul-projected state he was in. O Sun God of the highest and most holy, please accept the sacrifice on this altar. I offer you the heart of this sacrifice, and may you return to our world through blood and fire. Duncan immediately stopped himself and stared at the priest with eyes of watching a fool.